Okay, let's unpack this. Welcome to the deep dive, where we take the densest stack of sources, the articles, the biographies, the academic papers, and pull out the absolutely essential nuggets of knowledge you need to be instantly well-informed.
And today, we are profiling one of the most fascinating, brilliant, uncompromising, and ultimately one of the most tragic figures of 20th century American culture,
Zora Neale Hurston.
Zora Neale Hurston. And if you know her name, you probably know her as the literary giant, right?
Yeah.
The author who gave us their eyes were Watching God in 1937.
Which is a masterpiece.
It is, but to stop there is to miss the staggering complexity of her actual career. Our sources reveal a woman who didn't just write novels. She fundamentally reshaped how African-American culture was studied.
Right.
She was a formally trained anthropologist, a dedicated folklorist, a pioneering essayist, and even an early documentary filmmaker. I mean, her output profoundly shaped Africana Studies and ethnography in ways we are still grasping today.
Exactly. We have this incredible duality right at the core of her identity. On the one hand, she held a degree from Barnard and Columbia, placing her in the highest echelons of academia. And on the other, she spent years sleeping on porches, collecting stories, and participating in rituals in the deepest parts of the American South and the Caribbean.
And that dual nature is the key to our deep dive mission today.
Mm-hmm.
Her core academic goal, which was largely influenced by her mentors at Columbia, was revolutionary for its time:
What was it specifically?
to study African American and Caribbean communities from the inside, to treat their culture, their language, their spiritual practices, including hoodoo and vodou, with immense respect.
This is long before that was the standard.
Oh, long before. We need to explore how she managed to merge that literary genius, that raw conversational voice of her subjects, with the rigorous demands of academia, and then why this monumental figure essentially vanished into obscurity for decades, only to be resurrected later.
And when we talk about volume, her output is it's almost hard to comprehend. It crossed almost every genre boundary.
I mean, you've got 4 major novels, including her masterwork:
Then there's her compelling autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road.
the groundbreaking ethnographies, Mules and Men and Tell My Horse, over 50 short stories and plays, and we're still discovering her work.
Right, like the folktale collection Every Tongue Got to Confess and the essential narrative Baratune. Her life was this constant, almost exhausting movement between high literary culture, rigorous academic pursuit, and deep community immersion.
It's a miracle she accomplished half of what she did, especially when you consider the financial volatility of her life.
Okay, so let's start at the very beginning. Or perhaps what our sources suggest we could call the two beginnings of Zora Neale Hurston.
A good way to put it.
The physical facts tell us she was born on January 7, 1891. She was the 5th of 8 children in Notasulga, Alabama. Now, this fact often gets glossed over, but it's crucial to understand her context.
It really is. Both sets of her grandparents had been born into slavery. This was not far-removed history for her.
Not at all. Her father, John Hurston, began as a sharecropper, then became a Baptist preacher, and later a carpenter, while her mother, Lucien Potts, was a school teacher.
But that physical birthplace, Notasulga, is far less important than the geography of her soul. The place that truly shaped her worldview and became the fundamental setting for so many of her greatest stories.
Eatonville, Florida.
Eatonville. Her family moved there in 1894 when she was just 3, and Eatonville was a truly exceptional place. It was established in 1887, making it one of the very first all-black incorporated towns in the United States.
So she grew up in an environment where Black people were the government, the law enforcement, the merchants.
They defined the culture and the politics entirely.
Wow.
Precisely. Hurston grew up here, and, crucially, she described it as a place where African Americans could live and act as they desired, independent of the pervasive daily interference of white society and white supremacy that defined the rest of the Jim Crow South.
So her father wasn't just a preacher there.
No, he was elected mayor in 1897, and he was minister of the largest church, Macedonia Missionary Baptist. She experienced Black self-governance and self-determination from childhood.
Which explains why she so often claimed Eatonville as her actual birthplace.
Exactly. She was effectively declaring it her mythic hometown. It was where her identity, her freedom, and her narrative truly began.
And that independence, it seems, fed her intellectual curiosity very early on. We see the start of her lifelong literary awakening around 1901.
Yet what happened was a group of northern school teachers visited Eatonville and gave her books. She later described this influx of literature and mythology as a kind of personal birth, where she realized the world extended far beyond her town, but she already possessed the confidence to interact with it.
That formative environment, though, it didn't last.
Unfortunately, no. The pre-college years were incredibly turbulent. This is where we see the first cracks in her foundational structure. Her mother, who was her great intellectual influence, died in 1904.
And her father remarried very quickly.
Very quickly. He married Mattie Moge in 1905. And the whole thing was surrounded by scandal because he was rumored to have had relations with Moge before his first wife's death.
And that turmoil directly impacted her education.
It did. It led to a serious disruption. She was dismissed from a Baptist boarding school when the tuition payments just stopped.
That must have been devastating, going from the daughter of the mayor and a respected preacher to suddenly being adrift.
It was. She bounced around, lived with various family members, and eventually worked as a maid and wardrobe mistress for a touring theatrical company in 1916. This period of upheaval forced her to become fiercely resourceful and to, quite literally, write her own ticket.
Which brings us to the famous and necessary deception that altered the record of her life.
Right. In 1917, she's now 26 years old, and she wants to resume her formal education by attending night school at Morgan Academy in Baltimore.
But to qualify for a free high school education, she had to appear much younger.
So, Zora Neale Hurston began claiming 1901 as her birth year.
Shaving off a full decade.
A critical decade. It made her 16 instead of 26. And this wasn't about vanity. It was a pragmatic decision, essential for securing her future.
And the deception worked so well that 1901 was later incorrectly inscribed on her headstone.
A lie that outlived her. She successfully graduated from high school in 1918. And this early act of self-invention is foundational to understanding her later literary and political life. She believed profoundly in the individual's right to shape their own narrative and destiny, regardless of bureaucratic reality.
So, armed with this new, younger identity, she begins her academic launchpad at Howard University, an HBCU in Washington, D.C., starting in 1918.
A first-generation college student.
And she didn't just attend, she immediately contributed to the intellectual life of the campus. She co-founded the Hilltop Student newspaper and published her very first short stories. She earned an associate degree in 1920.
And her career just began to accelerate. Her short story, John Redding Goes to Sea, published in 1921, was her first major literary achievement.
And that qualified her for Alain Locke's prestigious literary club, The Stylus.
Which was her official entry into the intellectual circles of the burgeoning Harlem Renaissance. She had transitioned from the independent Black South to the epicenter of Black cultural production in the North.
The real academic leap, however, came in 1925. She jumped from Howard to Barnard College, part of Columbia University, on a scholarship facilitated by Barnard trustee Annie Nathanmeyer. Think about the stark contrast here.
I mean, she was the sole Black student at the women's college.
She's leaving a nurturing, all-Black educational environment for a segregated, overwhelmingly white, elite academic setting.
And this transition is absolutely critical to understanding her intellectual formation. While she assisted Annie Nathanmeyer in crashing a play, Black Souls, the academic core of her time, was spent training under the legendary Franz Boas at Columbia.
Boas. He's often called the father of American anthropology, and his influence on Hurston was just enormous.
It really was.
Can you elaborate on the significance of Boas for a moment? What did he teach that was so foundational to her life's work?
Well, Boas championed what's called cultural relativism. This was a radical concept in the 1920s, a time when hierarchical and evolutionary models of race models that ranked cultures from primitive to advanced were still common, even in science.
Okay.
Boas sought to overturn that framework entirely. He argued that every culture should be understood on its own terms, within its own context, without being judged against some arbitrary Western standard. It was a profoundly anti-racist, anti-supremacist framework.
So, for a Black scholar studying under Boas, the message was clear. African-American culture was not a degradation of African culture or an inferior version of white culture.
It was a complete, valid, complex system unto itself.
Right.
And this directly shaped Hurston's lifelong goal.
Right.
To use the anthropological lens to show the deep complexity, wisdom, and simply the validity of Black vernacular culture, effectively overturning the notion of racial hierarchy through detailed, respectful observation. She studied not only with Boas, but also with his students, like Ruth Benedict and Margaret Mead, earning her B.A. in anthropology in 1928.
Which solidifies her identity not just as a writer who happened to use folklore,
but as a professionally trained scientist of culture.
Okay, so she has the Ivy League pedigree and the mentorship of Boas. But to execute the kind of immersive field work that Boas demanded, living among the people, speaking their language, She needed significant funding.
She did. And this brings us to what I find to be one of the most fraught and difficult relationships of her early career, the patronage dynamic.
You're talking about Mrs. Charlotte Osgood Mason.
Yes, often referred to as godmother by Hurston and Langston Hughes, whom Mason also supported. Mason was a wealthy white philanthropist, and in 1927 she began providing Hurston with a critical $200 per month stipend for fieldwork.
Which was a substantial sum for the time.
A huge sum, and that support lasted until 1932.
A $200 stipend sounds like a great deal, especially for a black woman pursuing field science in the Jim Crow South. But the critique suggests this support came with massive strings attached.
It came with a heavy cost of intellectual control. Mason demanded all the material Hurston collected: Negro music, folklore, literature, hoodoo, everything. She insisted on complete ownership over Hurston's intellectual property and even restricted who she could share it with.
Wow.
Mason was interested in what she considered primitive or pure cultural expressions, often viewing the field material through her own romanticized or even paternalistic lens.
So Hurston, for 5 crucial years, had to constantly balance satisfying Mason's financial expectations with meeting the rigorous academic demands of Boas.
It was a tightrope walk between survival and intellectual integrity.
She used that money to dive deep into what she knew best, the cultural landscape of the South. Between 1928 and 1932, she traveled extensively, leading to her pioneering work, Mules and Men, published in 1935.
And Mules and Men is rightly celebrated as a truly groundbreaking work of what we now call literary anthropology. It documents African-American folklore, sermons, games, and material from turpentine camps, sawmills, and timber camps, particularly in North Florida.
And crucially, she didn't just record the stories, she inserted herself as a character.
Exactly. An ethnographer in the text who is accepted by the community and participates in the storytelling and ritual life. This methodological choice was highly influential.
And what makes this more than just a collection of quaint stories are the specific sociological observations she embedded right alongside the folklore. You mentioned the practice of paramour rites.
This is where her anthropological training provided a sharp political edge. She didn't shy away from documenting the power dynamics of racialized patriarchy.
So what was that exactly?
She described the common, disturbing practice of white men in positions of power owners, bosses, local politicians, taking black women as concubines, often fathering children with them, and exercising dominance rooted in slavery-era practices.
And she called this system paramour rites.
She or others later referred to it explicitly as that, based on the white men's unchallenged societal authority within the segregated South. This shows that her work was never merely a celebration of black culture. It was a deeply observant critique of the oppressive structures surrounding it.
Here is where we encounter the figure who truly links her fieldwork to the history of slavery. Cudjoe Cazola Lewis, or Cazola.
Right. He was the last known survivor of the illegal transatlantic slave trade, trafficked aboard the Clotilda in 1860, and Hurston traveled to Plateau, Alabama, to interview him extensively.
Her first published account based on his life came out in 1928, titled Cudjoe's Own Story of the Last African Slaver. This interaction is foundational, but it is also where the academic controversy first emerged regarding her methodology.
Yes, and this is where we need to dive into that specific detail.
The sources suggest that this initial 1928 article contained plagiarism. That's a massive academic failing, especially for a student mentored by Boas. What exactly happened?
Well, the initial discovery, later detailed by her biographer Robert E. Hemingway, was that the 1928 article was largely lifted, sometimes word for word, from a 1914 book written by Emma Langdon Roche, who had also interviewed Lewis.
So it wasn't just a similar idea, it was actual text.
It was actual text. Now, Hurston did add new original information about Lewis's home village of Bantay, but the core narrative structure and some phrasing were copied. Hemingway later claimed that she never plagiarized again, suggesting it was an early, perhaps desperate mistake made under the pressure of needing to produce content for her patron, Mason.
But plagiarism is a huge ethical red flag. How did a figure so committed to the truth of Black life compromise her academic integrity at this critical juncture?
That tension is the central paradox of her early career. The patronage dynamic created an environment of haste and pressure. She was often traveling with little support, needing to constantly produce material that satisfied Mason's aesthetic tastes and Boas's scientific requirements. It's possible she saw the earlier text as simply existing folklore that she was refining, or maybe she just cut corners.
It's a significant mark against her academic record, though.
No question. It established a pattern of ethical flexibility in the pursuit of a compelling narrative, a pattern that would surface again.
Despite that misstep, she returned to Lewis, conducting more interviews, taking photographs, and recording the only known film footage of him. This material became the basis for Barracoon, the story of the last black cargo.
A book she completed in 1931, but shockingly, wasn't published until 2018.
2018. Why the delay?
Publishers in the 1930s rejected it, primarily because Hurston refused to modernize Lewis's dialect. She insisted on transcribing his language exactly as he spoke it, a method that publishers worried would be inaccessible or off-putting to a mainstream audience.
And the title Barracoon, what does that mean?
It refers to the temporary barracks, where captured Africans were imprisoned before being shipped overseas. The narrative she created was highly dramatic and emotionally resonant, a semi-fictionalized account that allowed Lewis's voice to be heard directly, uncensored.
That blending of hard fact and storytelling, where she prioritizes the emotional or narrative truth over strict quantitative objectivity, that seems to be the hallmark of her methodology, right?
Absolutely. And that approach continued when she went international. In 1937, she received a prestigious Guggenheim Fellowship, which allowed her to escape the Mason patronage dynamic and conduct independent ethnographic research in Jamaica and Haiti.
And this resulted in Tell My Horse, Voodoo and Life in Haiti and Jamaica, published in 1938.
A truly genre-defying book. It mixes rigorous anthropology with folklore and deeply personal narrative.
Can you give us a specific example of her fieldwork method in that context?
Sure. Look at her description of the 9-night ritual in St. Thomas, Jamaica, which is a traditional period of mourning and celebration after a death. Instead of delivering a dry, technical, or quantitative analysis of the social structure of the ritual, she participates. She aims to capture the atmosphere, the spiritual fervor, and the dynamic social interactions. She describes the singing, the dancing, the atmosphere of dread and excitement regarding the duppy, or spirit, lingering around the body.
So she's documenting the experience of belief, not just the data points of the ritual.
Precisely. And I can see how that makes for powerful reading, but I can also imagine why it would make traditional academics nervous.
It seems like it would.
It did. That vibrancy drew significant criticism. Her representation of voodoo in Tell My Horse, with its focus on zombies and dramatic rituals, was seen by some as sensationalist, playing into existing exotic stereotypes rather than conducting sober science.
And the critique went deeper, didn't it, regarding her earlier work?
It did. We know from a later letter she wrote to Ruth Benedict that she admitted to fabricating material and dialogue for Mules and Men.
Wait, she admitted to fabrication. That undermines the entire premise of objective ethnography.
It does. She specifically mentioned inventing the story of rival voodoo doctors as a child in her later autobiography, Dust Tracks on a Road, to satisfy the expectations of her audience or patrons, likely Mason. Critics have argued that while her qualitative method was revolutionary, the blurring of lines between authentic documentation and narrative flair that need to tell a better story made her methodology highly questionable to academic colleagues.
The constant friction between the novelist and the scientist in her head.
That's it exactly. But despite the controversies, her commitment to documenting Black culture continued unabated during the Depression era, even leading her to federal employment.
Right. She worked for the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, from 1938 to 1939.
Yes, part of the Works Progress Administration. She was gathering information for Florida's historical and cultural collection, leveraging her fieldwork skills for a public history project.
And this is where her ethnomusicology, her study of music in its cultural context, truly shines through.
The material she collected for the FWP included incredible audio documents of Black vernacular music and performance. She preserved pieces like the Crow Dance, which is a Bahamian American dance song with deep West African roots. She recorded the Gullah Geechee song, Oh, the Beaufort Boat Done Come, documenting the culture of the Sea Islands.
And she captured Gabriel Brown's performance of the legendary folk song John Henry.
Yeah. It shows a deep, multifaceted commitment to preserving the total cultural tradition, the language, the story, and the song, all of which she saw as integral to Black identity.
It's truly amazing that she found the time and the mental space to write novels while simultaneously navigating dangerous field conditions and dealing with demanding patrons. Let's pivot fully now to the literary explosion that happened concurrently with her fieldwork.
Yeah.
When Hurston arrived in New York City in 1925, the Harlem Renaissance was absolutely at its cultural zenith.
And she didn't just attend the Renaissance. She became one of its central, most firebrand figures. She published her short story Spunk in the New Negro, Alain Locke's landmark anthology, immediately establishing her voice.
And she was quickly involved with what they playfully, perhaps provocatively, called the Niggerati group.
A group that included fellow literary giants like Langston Hughes and Wallace Thurman.
What was their focus?
This cohort was focused on rejecting the traditional, often sentimental portrayal of Black life that was popular among older Black intellectuals and white patrons. They wanted something raw, complex, and sometimes deliberately shocking.
And this ambition resulted in the short-lived but incredibly influential literary magazine called Fire in 1926.
One issue. It only lasted one issue because it was so controversial and financially disastrous, but it crystallized a generational split in the Harlem literary scene.
And that desire for uncompromising creative control led to one of the great collaborations and subsequent falling outs of the movement.
The dramatic dispute with Langston Hughes over the play Mulebone, a comedy of Negro life.
Right. They wrote it together in 1930.
The premise was based on the folklore she had collected, capturing the specific idiom and humor of the Southern Black community. But a dispute over ownership and performance rights, partially fueled by the interference of their patron, Charlotte Osgood Mason, who often stoked competition, destroyed their friendship permanently.
And the play was shelved for decades.
It was so bitter that the play itself was never staged in its own time. It only premiered in 1991.
Wow. That collapse over the play, which was essentially a fight over whose vision of Black vernacular culture would prevail, really underscores that fierce individualism that defined Hurston.
Absolutely. She was unwilling to compromise her artistic interpretation, even if it cost her one of the most important friendships and professional collaborations of her career.
Her individual literary career flourished nonetheless throughout her fieldwork years. Her first novel, Jonah's Gourdvine, was published in 1934.
Drawing heavily on her family history and the culture of Black Southern preachers.
Then Came Their Eyes Were Watching God in 1937, her masterwork.
Which she famously wrote in just 7 weeks while conducting ethnographic research in Haiti under the Guggenheim.
Just incredible. Her third novel, a retelling of the Exodus story, Moses, Man of the Mountain, followed in 1939. And then there's the final published novel, Seraph on the Suwannee, from 1948.
A radical departure.
In what way?
It centers principally on white characters and explores the identities of so-called white trash women in Florida.
Which is a very different focus for her.
It's a complex and often overlooked novel. Some scholars suggest that this meditation on objection, poverty, and the construction of class and gender identities among poor whites. It actually reflects a complicated engagement with the eugenics discourses of the 1920s and 30s.
Really, eugenics, that was a highly problematic pseudoscientific movement. How does her novel engage with that?
Well, it doesn't endorse it, but it certainly investigates the social construction of supposed inherent worth or lack thereof, even among different groups of white Americans.
Yeah.
By shifting her focus away from the politics of race and onto the politics of class and character among poor whites, she was perhaps trying to universalize the struggle for self-determination that was central to her own life, regardless of skin color.
Concurrent with her novel writing, she was deeply committed to developing Black dramatic expression. She didn't just want to collect folklore.
She wanted to perform it.
Right.
In 1934, she established a School of Dramatic Arts at Bethune-Cookman College, an HBCU in Daytona Beach. Her goal was to create theater based on pure Negro expression, drawing directly from the songs, dances, and rituals she documented.
And her theatrical reviews, like The Great Day, reflected this belief that folklore should not remain passive on the page.
It should be dramatized and brought to life by the community it came from, but that passion for performance cost her.
Financially, I mean.
Oh, yeah. The Great Day only had one performance and left Hurston in $600 worth of debt, a huge amount back then. It shows the sheer financial volatility of her career. She was constantly reinvesting any money she earned back into her art and her research.
Her academic residencies also reflect this constant tension between her brilliant mind and her unconventional persona.
Yes. She took a position in the drama department at the North Carolina College for Negroes NCC for the 1939-1940 academic year. But while she was teaching there, she was simultaneously engaged in a remarkable academic maneuver.
She was secretly studying at the segregated University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, UNC.
A secret student at the highly segregated white institution. She was participating in coursework in theater groups and being mentored by faculty like the Pulitzer Prize-winning playwright Paul Green.
That's just audacious. She's simultaneously working at a Black college and taking classes at a segregated white college. How did that even work?
It was an open secret among the faculty who respected her brilliance. if not publicly acknowledged by the administration. However, her tenure at NCC ended abruptly after only 1 year.
Why?
Well, the sources point clearly to a difficult departure stemming from her relationship with NCC's president, James E. Shepard.
And the conflict was personal, wasn't it? Not just intellectual.
Profoundly personal. Shepard reportedly found Hurston's attire. She was known for her flamboyant, slightly bohemian style and her overall lifestyle inappropriate for an unmarried woman on campus.
Ah.
She was fiercely independent, unmarried, traveling extensively, and unwilling to conform to the strict behavioral codes expected of a female academic at an HBCU at the time. Her independent spirit, while fueling her creativity, fundamentally clashed with institutional expectations of respectability. She simply refused to be contained.
That refusal to be contained by conventional expectations brings us sharply into the later phase of her career, where her contrarian political edge became so pronounced that it contributed significantly to her professional obscurity.
Yes, and let's start with a major late career assignment that allowed her to use her anthropological background for journalism. The sensational Ruby McCollum murder trial of 1952-1953.
Right. She was hired by the prominent black newspaper, the Pittsburgh Courier, to cover this highly publicized case. Ruby McCollum, a wealthy black woman, was accused of killing C. Leroy Adams, a white doctor, state politician, and alleged lover.
And Hurston immediately approached this not just as a crime story, but through her own academic lens. She saw the case potentially revolving entirely around the system of paramour rights.
That same white male sexual dominance she had documented decades earlier in the North Florida lumber camps.
Exactly. She and the editor believed the trial was a prime opportunity to expose this toxic, systemic practice to a national audience. But upon arrival, she faced immediate journalistic hurdles.
The judge issued a strict gag order.
A gag order, and there was a profound silence from both black and white residents. This silence was likely enforced by fear, possibly related to Dr. Adams' alleged involvement in Ruby's husband's illegal gambling operation.
A dangerous undercurrent to the whole affair.
Very.
Despite the obstacles, Hurston achieved something monumentally important in that coverage.
She focused intensely on Ruby McCollum's testimony in her own defense. And this is the achievement. McCollum's testimony marked the first time an African-American woman was allowed to testify as to the paternity of her child by a white man in a segregated Southern court.
A crack in the Jim Crow wall.
It was. Hurston celebrated this victory, declaring in print that McCollum's testimony had sounded the death toll of paramour rights in the segregated South.
But once again, her professional ethics became murky. She shared her deep foundational material from the first trial with a white journalist, William Bradford Huey,
who then wrote the bestseller Ruby McCollum, Woman in the Sewanee Jail in 1956. And Huey, despite using her essential fieldwork and insights, only gave Hurston a brief passing acknowledgement.
which again points to her difficulty navigating the practical world of professional advancement.
Right. She was perhaps too trusting or too focused on the larger goal of getting the story out, regardless of who published the definitive account.
Regardless of the journalistic setbacks, the truly defining characteristic of her later life was her profound and unwavering political individualism. Hurston was a Republican.
Yes, aligning herself with the politics of the old right. We need to unpack what that means. The old right of the mid-20th century was largely isolationist, fiscally conservative, and fiercely opposed to the expansion of federal governmental power.
She was a spiritual heir to the philosophy of Booker T. Washington.
The emphasis on self-reliance, economic independence, and working within established structures to build community strength, rather than prioritizing federal intervention or social upheaval.
She famously separated herself from the collective civil rights activism of the rising generation. She stated, "I am not interested in the race problem, but I am interested in the problems of individuals, white ones and black ones."
It's a radical individualist position. She criticized race pride and race consciousness, arguing it was a thing to be abhorred.
What was her reasoning there?
Her reasoning was fascinating. She believed that basing one's pride on something as arbitrary as race was illogical. Why assume every black person is automatically a genius like Carver, or every white person is a genius like Edison? Achievement, she argued, belongs purely to the individual.
And these contrarian views extended to her economic philosophy, placing her firmly against the liberal consensus that was forming around Roosevelt's New Deal.
In 1951, she harshly criticized the New Deal, arguing it had inadvertently created a harmful dependency among African Americans on the government, ceding too much power and self-determination to distant politicians.
This fear of centralized paternalistic government control was paramount for her.
Absolutely. She supported the conservative Republican Senator Robert A. Taft's 1952 presidential campaign and consistently opposed interventionist foreign policy. She even called Harry Truman the butcher of Asia after the dropping of the atomic bombs on Japan.
Given this staunch individualism and anti-political stance, it's not surprising that she drew the ire of her more politically motivated literary peers.
Yes, this is where we return to Richard Wright, who essentially delivered a devastating career blow.
His famous critique of Their Eyes were watching God.
Right. He argued that the novel exploits that phase of Negro life which is quaint and satisfies the chauvinistic tastes of a white audience. He dismissed it as lacking theme, no message, no thought.
Which was more than a literary disagreement. It was a political indictment.
It was, Wright, who wrote explicitly about the brutal realities of racial oppression, believed literature had to serve the political struggle of the race. He saw Hurston's focus on folklore, dialect, and the internal dynamics of a segregated community as an evasion.
A failure to advance the political cause.
And this critique had weight because it captured the changing literary mood. In the late 30s and 40s, the mood shifted toward realism, urban grit, and political protest, embodied by Wright and later Ralph Ellison. Hurston's celebration of the vernacular just seemed outdated and apolitical by comparison.
But perhaps the most jarring political stance she took, viewed through the modern historical lens, was her opposition to the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court ruling.
This stance baffles many modern readers, but it must be understood within her framework of radical individualism and anti-centralism. In her 1955 piece in the Orlando Sentinel, Court Order Can't Make the Races Mix, she argued that if separate schools were truly equal, which she contended they were rapidly becoming mandated, mixing wouldn't improve education.
So what was the deeper philosophical motivation for opposing a ruling designed to end segregation?
Her fear was twofold. First, she feared the demise of established black schools and the subsequent displacement of black teachers and administrators who were essential custodians of cultural tradition.
Okay.
Second, and critically, she viewed the ruling as establishing a dangerous legal precedent for an all-powerful federal government to undermine individual liberty on a broad range of future issues. To her, mandated mixing was just as tyrannical as mandated separation if it came from a centralized, coercive power source.
So her position wasn't one of supporting segregation, which she had always opposed.
No, not at all. It was a deeply skeptical view of centralized power forcing societal change upon the individual.
This is why scholars today categorize her political identity using terms like conservative and libertarian.
Exactly. John McWhorter characterized her as America's favorite black conservative.
Yeah.
Others have compared her radical individualism to figures like Rose Walder Lane and Isabel Patterson, early libertarian writers who shared that deep, almost visceral distrust of federal intervention.
Her genius was rooted in the black community, but her politics placed her far outside the emerging black political consensus.
Far outside.
And finally, we should touch on her personal spiritual views, which, like everything else about her, defy simple categorization.
She rejected organized religion and theism. She wrote very clearly in Dust Tracks on a Road, "Prayer seems to me a cry of weakness. I accept the challenge of responsibility."
And yet, this deeply skeptical, rational mind was the same person who dedicated her life to documenting and even participating in rituals of deep spiritual faith like voodoo and hoodoo.
It's a profound contradiction. The anthropologist in her retained an intense professional interest in religion and folklore from a cultural standpoint. She didn't just study voodoo, she participated in the rituals alongside her research subjects, sometimes even to the point of trance, to better understand and document the cultural experience.
The pursuit of anthropological knowledge often transcended her personal non-belief.
It did. It showed that for Hurston, the search for truth about humanity was always more important than personal dogma.
So we have this amazing, complex, prolific woman writer, scholar, firebrand, and yet she slid quickly into obscurity for decades.
And it wasn't just her contrarian politics that alienated her from the progressive intellectual community. It was a fundamental cultural shift in literary taste that left her behind.
A shift centered on language and representation.
That's right. Her distinctive use of African-American dialect, which she painstakingly documented through her fieldwork to represent the authentic speech patterns of the time, suddenly fell out of favor.
Why? Why did the language she had championed as authentic suddenly become a problem?
Younger writers and critics regarded dialect as demeaning. often linking it to minstrelsy or a caricature rooted in white racist traditions that exploited black culture for entertainment. They felt it undermined the dignity and political seriousness of the race.
So the literary landscape was shifting.
To the political and stylistic realism of authors like Richard Wright and Ralph Ellison, Hurston, who championed the internal life and vernacular expression of the community, was perceived as having failed to evolve with the times.
The outcome was financially devastating. Hurston struggled immensely in her last decade, often living in grinding poverty.
She worked as a freelance writer, a substitute teacher, and in her 60s, she took work as a maid on Miami Beach's affluent Revo Alto Island, fighting just to make ends meet and eventually relying on public assistance.
There are details from this period that truly illustrate the tragedy of her neglect.
The one that always gets me is from 1957. She managed to secure a job at the Pan American World Airways Technical Library at Patrick Air Force Base, hoping to leverage her extensive academic background.
And
She was fired after only a few months for being deemed too well educated for the role. The breadth of her knowledge, the very thing we celebrate, became an obstacle to earning a stable living.
it's an indictment of the era that a major American author and anthropologist died in poverty.
She passed away from hypertensive heart disease on January 28, 1960, at the age of 69, in a St. Lucie County welfare home. And she was buried in Fort Pierce, Florida, in an unmarked grave, seemingly forgotten by the world she had so brilliantly documented.
But her story doesn't end with her burial. This is where we encounter a critical intervention that saved her intellectual legacy from complete destruction.
Yes. After her death, a local law officer and friend, Patrick Duval, noticed a yardman in Fort Pierce burning Hurston's papers and belongings.
Burning them, just destroying her life's work.
Burning them. Duval stopped the burning, literally snatching her manuscripts and notes from the flames. This act of quick thinking saved an invaluable collection of literary and anthropological documents.
What was in there?
A manuscript of her novel Seraph on the Swanee, and, crucially, an unpublished biography of Herod the Great.
That saved material. That was the roadmap for her eventual scholarly rediscovery.
It was. It was stored for 2 years and eventually donated to the University of Florida Libraries, Yale's James Weldon Johnson Collection, and other archives.
And the catalyst for that rediscovery came over a decade later in 1973.
With novelist Alice Walker. Walker was researching Hurston for a feature, and she and scholar Charlotte D. Hunt traveled to Fort Pierce to find her grave.
And they found an unmarked plot in the general area and installed a marker.
A marker that, though it mistakenly used the incorrect 1901 birth year, bore a defiant inscription, "A Genius of the South," a line borrowed from the poet Jean Toomer.
That marker was a declaration, and the official global revival kicked off just 2 years later.
When Alice Walker published her seminal article, In Search of Zora Neale Hurston, in Mrs. Magazine in 1975.
And that single essay acted like an intellectual earthquake.
It prompted a massive, decades-long resurgence of interest among scholars, readers, and literary critics who recognized that Hurston's unique voice, her celebration of internal community life, and her unapologetic use of vernacular were not flaws, but fundamental strengths.
She was retroactively placed into the American literary canon.
And today, the recognition is finally widespread and ongoing. Eatonville hosts the annual Zora Festival. Her house in Fort Pierce is now a National Historic Landmark, and she's been inducted into the National Women's Hall of Fame and the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame.
And we continue to see posthumous publications drawing from those salvaged papers.
Including the complete folk tales in every tongue got to confess in 2001, and the full narrative of the slave ship survivor in Barracoon in 2018. And there's one more major discovery coming. Her unfinished novel, The Life of Herod the Great, is forthcoming in January 2025, demonstrating that even 65 years after her death, her work is still teaching us and challenging us. Her legacy, once nearly lost to poverty and flames, is now celebrated globally as an essential pillar of American literature and anthropology.
When we look back at Zora Neale Hurston's dual life, we see a trajectory of profound and often contradictory identities. She was the academically trained folklorist who insisted on capturing the authentic vernacular and voice of the Black community in all its complexity, and the writer who used that voice to create timeless stories that transcended, or perhaps rejected, the political slogans of her time. Her entire life was an uncompromising stand for individuality and self-reliance, no matter the personal or professional cost.
Her trajectory is truly startling, spanning from being the sole Black student at Barnard College, receiving mentorship from the greatest anthropologist of her generation, to fighting poverty as a maid on Miami Beach, deemed too well educated for a library job.
It's just stunning.
Her ability to operate within the highest academic circles while simultaneously immersing herself completely in the rituals of hoodoo and the realities of Florida lumber camps, not as an outsider but as an accepted participating community member, raises a profound question about authenticity and representation in ethnographic work that scholars still debate today.
And that deep tension, that uncompromising individualism also characterized her political life. It forces us to ask, how do we, as readers and students of history, reconcile the celebration of her artistic genius with the critique of her fiercely individualistic and often contrarian political choices?
I mean, she once stood firmly against mandatory integration, not out of support for Jim Crow,
Right.
but because of a deeply rooted libertarian fear that centralized federal power would ultimately destroy Black cultural institutions like Black schools and Black colleges and strip individuals of their hard-won sense of self-reliance. This position alienated her from the civil rights consensus that defined the latter half of the 20th century.
So here's the question for you, the listener, to mull over as you conclude this deep dive. Do her fiercely contrarian political positions, which undeniably led to her immediate professional obscurity among her progressive peers in the mid-20th century, ultimately serve to make her legacy of radical self-reliance even stronger and more provocative today?
What does it mean to celebrate a genius whose political philosophy actively undermined the consensus of the very movement that produced her? That tension between cultural affirmation and political independence remains the deepest, most challenging part of the Zora Neale Hurston legacy.